Hey everyone, this is Mike from MDXpods. I just want to say from everybody at MDXpods, myself, Katrina, and Alex from Remake Rewind, that we are advocates and allies for the LGBTQIA plus community. This is our first ever Pride episode of Ruin My Childhood. Um, it being a nostalgia podcast, 80s and 90s, there weren't necessarily a lot of Pride movies that were appropriate for kids to see. So it took us a little bit of time to figure out a movie that Katrina and I had both seen. In our formative years, so we decided to cover the Birdcage. We just want to point out that there are some slurs that we would never use that are used quite a bit in the film that we are not using on this episode, except for one time when we're doing a direct quote from the movie. But that being said, we want to be as inclusive and accepting of everybody as we possibly can be, and we also want to recognize that, especially me in a place of privilege, being a cis white heterosexual male born and raised in California, who's lived in California my whole life, I recognize that I am very privileged, that I am not going to have the same struggles that so many people in the community have. And also just not me being able to relate to the material in the same way. I just want everyone to know that if there's anything that I say that is not correct or can be worded better, um, please feel free to reach out to me on social media or leave me a voicemail on the voicemail that will be in the episode description. It's also on our Instagram profile. But that being said, we want to be great allies, so feel free to let us know if there's anything we should be thinking about. But that being said, please enjoy this episode on the Birdcage.
Ruin My Childhood.
You're listening to Ruin My Childhood, the podcast where we decide if some things are better left in the past. I'm Kat.
I'm Mike.
And what are we discussing this time?
Well, it's a topical month. It's Pride Month, and we're for the first time ever, we're going to actually try to do a Pride, not try to do a Pride movie. We are going to do a Pride movie. We're going to be watching the Birdcage starring Robin Williams and Nathan Lane.
What do you remember about it? Did you watch this as a kid?
I did. I do remember. That's why we cover this. We spent a good week or so trying to just figure out what movie we're going to do for Pride. And we realized, one, there's not a ton of kid-appropriate movies that were Pride from, the 80s and 90s. But also, there was a gap in what I had seen. So you sent me a couple movies that you thought we should do. I sent you a few, and it turns out the ones that I had seen, you hadn't seen. The ones you had seen, I hadn't really seen until we figured out we had both seen The Birdcage. And the only reason I would have seen this movie was my parents both loved Robin Williams, and I'm sure that's the only reason they watched this movie.
Right.
My family growing up was pretty conservative. There wasn't, we were always pop culture people.
This was right on the heels of Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yeah. And so and my dad loved Robin Williams. So I remember them renting this movie. I didn't watch it right when it came out, but I think I saw it for the first time in like middle school. So a few years after it came out. But I do think, this is still pretty early in terms of like pop culture. Like this is pre Will and Grace and everything, and before it was still 100% acceptable to have gay leading characters in a movie, at least.
We forget about the risks that actors like Robin Williams and Patrick Swayze and
Tom Hanks,
Hilary Swank, and even Ellen DeGeneres, lover or hater, all took by being open about who they are at the time that they were. And
being willing to play, like in Robin Williams' case, being willing to play a homosexual man when he is a straight man. And, it's interesting. But in terms of like what I remember about the movie, obviously this wasn't something we watched a million times. I really just remember the overall plot of a man who was raised by two men is getting married to a conservative family and tries to hide his family's history. But all that really stands out to me is I just remember vividly Nathan Lane in a blonde wig trying to be pass as a woman. And that's all I really remember is Nathan Lane.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we would have watched this in my household growing up. I think it's more of like a, when I was 11 or 12 or 13, we had satellite and you just watch whatever movie's on.
Yeah.
I think it was that kind of situation is the only context in which I would have seen this. Although I do remember seeing it, and I remember very much liking the whole Miami Beach ambiance, because I do remember that it does an incredible job of building the world.
Yeah.
And I've just always been drawn to stuff like that. So thinking back on it now and what little I remember about the plot, I kind of have low expectations for how well it holds up. I think it's going to be very cringy.
I think it will be as well. I think, and me being a cis white heterosexual male,
Privilege.
I do have privilege. No doubt about that. It's going to be, I think this one's going to be a challenging one for me to discuss because this isn't necessarily, this was made for mainstream, but it's not necessarily, it was definitely not made for me in 1996 being, you know, an 8-year-old boy. But even, you know, in 2020 looking at it, I don't know. I mean, I am the target demographic for it because this was a mass market appeal, but I'm also not the person that they're trying to relate to character wise. So I think this is going to be kind of a challenging one for me to talk about when we get to it.
I think it is. I think this is going to be one of those situations in which we're going to have to separate the art from the artists and what we know about them, what we know about their convictions. And also, you know, even recognizing that these actors who we revere so much, whose work that we absolutely adore, they've evolved with time as well.
Yeah.
So there are things like, I mean, we all know Hank Azaria is in this film, and he famously bowed out of continuing to play Apu. And I think that's a huge testament to who he is as an artist.
Yeah, and we've talked about this countless movies that we've covered. You know, I think this is our 90th episode or close to, late 80s, early 90s, in terms of numbers of episodes we've done. And we've brought up the fact that a lot of movies are products of their time and jokes that were appropriate then are not appropriate now. And I feel like it's going to be one of those. So we're just going to have to deal with that as we discuss the movie, that recognize it's a different world
Should
today.
we watch it? Let's chew this thing to death.
Yeah, let's do it.
When Val Goldman said,
I'm getting married.
his fiance's father said,
Has he been tested?
his father said,
So this is hell.
and his other father said, now it's up to Armand
Teaching you to act like a man.
to straighten out their act before dinner.
How do you feel about the Dolphins? 4th and 3 play on their 30-yard line with only 34 seconds to go.
How do you think I feel? Betrayed? Bewildered?
The Birdcage, a Mike Nichols film.
Wrong response?
Rated R. Starts Friday.
All right, we are back from watching The Birdcage. What's your knee-jerk reaction?
I mean, I still found it to be very funny. There were a lot more slurs that, you know, I can't really say. A lot more than I would have expected. Because I know this has always been a pride-friendly, you know, big part of the community. So I was a little shocked about it. But then I was also just kind of like outraged by the general premise of the movie. Just the fact that a man is hiding from his conservative in-laws. And it's like, was he expecting to just never have his family interact for 50 years, 70 years?
It's completely insane.
Yeah, like this, just the premise didn't make any sense. Like this is a farcical premise. And like, it was hard for me to suspend my disbelief long enough to engage with the content, even though I loved the performances and there was some really good dialogue that could not be written today.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Could maybe not even be displayed today, depending on the context. So this was directed by Mike Nichols, who is, I mean, such a heavyweight. He did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, The Graduate, Working Girl, Catch-22. Written by Elaine May, but it was based on a play by Jean Poiret, right?
Yep.
I think.
Yep.
And Francis Weber, Edouard Molinaro, and Marcelo Sanon.
Yeah.
I think I pronounced
so
those
based
correctly.
off a play, then there was a French-Italian film.
This is the seventh iteration.
Yeah, La Cage des Fous is the original French version.
The remake of La Cage aux Folles. Folles?
I don't know. People who've listened to both podcasts, Remake Rewind, and this know I'm terrible with accents. So.
It has a Rotten Tomatoes critic score of 82 and an audience score of 81. The budget was $31 million.
Wow.
And it brought in $185 million.
That's pretty crazy.
Damn. I would not have guessed that.
No.
But I also, I tend to forget that something like this that we would see as kind of niche today, maybe a little bit more niche, especially if you get rid of the big names, like the whole concept isn't a big draw. But at the time, movies were in theaters for longer, and there were less things playing, and so
I would like to see a P&L for this movie, because like all that money had to go to the stars, because it's mostly in one location. There's most of the movies in the house, and then there are quite a few scenes in the club, but that's pretty much it. It's like 2 locations for like 80% of the movie, with a handful of other interior locations that are just homes.
Very little if it was actually shot in Miami Beach.
Yeah, so I'm curious that all had to be Gene Hackman and Robin Williams taking most of that money.
It had to be.
So like in terms of production, I'm the one who normally kind of like writes our production notes and the history of the movies. I couldn't really find much other than, this was in development in some way, shape, or form going back to the early 80s, and it was going to be Frank Sinatra and Dudley Moore, but Dudley Moore dropped out of it. It started getting steam again in the early 90s, and it was going to be Steve Martin playing more the straight man, Armand, and Robin Williams was going to play Albert, the more flamboyant one. But when Steve Martin dropped out, which he says is one of the biggest regrets that he ever had, because he never actually worked with Robin Williams on a film. They performed together on stage, but never on a film. But once he dropped out, Robin Williams took the more serious role, and then this was kind of Nathan Lane's big break. But other than that, it was received really well. It's
so weird to think of that as his big break when he was already so famous for his work on Broadway.
Well, and then you think for us, him being in The Lion King was something we watched a million times,
Well, and right before he did this, he was opening A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. I think he played Pseudolus, right? He was like the main character in that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of his role.
Yeah, it's crazy that this, like you said, is his first big movie
Although
role.
I guess Zero Mostel has something to say about that.
But
Is he?
I don't know.
Is it the same character?
I don't know.
Cut that out if it's not the same character.
Yeah, I will. And then just Glad made a big thing about this movie. They praised it for going beyond the stereotypes to see characters with depth and humanity and celebrating the differences, but also pointing out that it's outrageous to hide those. So this movie was a big deal at the time. This was also #1 at the box office for 3 weeks until Cape Fear came out, which was another huge
of all
movie.
things.
Right. But this was also the biggest opening of a movie that starred to the main characters being homosexual, and it held that record until Bruno came out.
Bruno's homosexual?
Yeah.
That was lost on me.
Sacha Baron Cohen movie?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was totally supposed to be. Are you joking? Are you joshing with me?
Maybe I haven't seen it.
I don't think you've seen it.
I've
It was
seen
really
that
bad.
one.
Don't watch it. But yeah, I mean, this movie was a big deal at the time. Like, it was a huge financial success, and it held a record for almost 20 years for being the biggest opening for essentially a Pride film.
All right. How about you give us a little summary? Get us going.
Super simple plot. Val is a college student who was raised by Armand and Albert, 2 gay men in South Beach, Florida. He is getting married to Calista Flockhart. I can't remember her character's name. Barbara. Who is the daughter of a very conservative U.S. senator who just kind of hitched his wagon to a another senator who died in very embarrassing circumstances. So to kind of save the honor of his future in-laws, Val asks his parents to hide the fact that they're gay men and pretend to be conservatives for the weekend when they meet his future in-laws for the first time.
It's pretty horrendous.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrendous.
It's awful.
All
Val
right.
is such a dick.
So we have Robin Williams, of course, as Armand, Nathan Lane as Albert. Armand owns the club.
Yep.
It's a drag show, right?
Yeah, it's a drag show.
Like I'm sure. I think everything in the club kind of revolves around the evening drag shows, and Albert is the star of the show. Starina. And at the top of the film, he's basically having a panic attack. He's supposed to go on in 5 minutes, and we get this crash course on their relationship between Albert, Armand, and then
Their
houseboy Agador, who's played by Hank Azaria. That whole dynamic is like a whirlwind, and there's so much to see, and there's so much happening, and there's so much dialogue. What was really strange about this, especially considering the caliber of Robin Williams at the time and Gene Hackman, was that they had extensive rehearsals because it was, of course, adapted.
Right.
And I guess the director wanted to maintain some of that dynamic, so they rehearsed it to death. And with all of, the genius that they're able to come up with for improvising, they had to actually kind of lock it down and decide what was going to go in the script. So I guess it was kind of like his way of managing the inevitable ego that could occur on set, because you have Robin Williams being Robin Williams, but then Nathan Lane's character is so big. Like, how do you give that room to breathe?
Well, I read that Mike Nichols did allow them to do extensive improvisation, but they were required to lock down the script as it was written and get a really good version of every scene as it was written before they were allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a combination of a very strict rehearsal, very strict, but also room to play afterwards. So I would be curious to see like how many of the scenes that ended up in the movie are the actual scripted versions and how many of them are the improvised versions.
Right. And I wonder how many different versions that they had of the script before they actually made it to the shooting script, because it sounds so freaking like almost painfully collaborative.
Yeah.
And like Hank Azaria has talked a lot about it because it was his breakout role.
Yeah.
So it's brought up in interviews all the time because he's just so good in this. And, there have been a lot of shifting attitudes and shifting climates over a number of things pertaining to his character. But he was saying that he was also involved in that collaborative process and that the character was somehow simultaneously based off of Judy Garland's dresser, because Judy Garland had this dynamic with her dresser where she would be so worked up before a number that she'd be freaking out, and he kind of had to create this dynamic where he was the one having a panic attack over dressing her and like getting everything together, and he would kind of like create this crisis for her to then kind of step in and be like the level-headed one and the relaxed one, and it would like help her self-regulate.
That's hilarious.
So the character was based off of that, but then he realized that he was also basing the voice and some of the mannerisms off of his grandmother, who I guess his grandparents were Sephardic Jews. So they spoke, it's not Spanish, it's a dialect. Anyway, Ladino. His grandmother spoke Ladino. So he kind of like based it off of that. But now he's actually said that he wouldn't even play the role because the character's Guatemalan, and he just wouldn't feel right about it.
And that's something that I've always respected about him. Like when, that documentary came out about how Apu is really, offensive, and he stepped out of it. He's just like, you're right. I've listened to the community. I'm done. But another topic, you have Darren Criss, the guy from Glee.
Mm-hmm.
He is a straight man, and he's come and said, well, I'm not going to play gay characters anymore.
It just wasn't fair. He cornered the market.
Yeah, but it is interesting because there are, and you look at trans actors. There's still not a ton of roles for trans actors. It's getting better and better.
Well, and there are fewer roles for ugly gay characters,
right? And it's like how there's so few opportunities. Like, how is it okay for a straight person to take these roles? Now, there's got to be something for the art, whoever is the best actor to an extent. But if there's an opportunity to have a true gay person who knows what it's like to be in the role and they're a fantastic actor, they should get it. And so I do think it's would be wrong for him to play this character if this movie was made today, because let somebody who hasn't traditionally had the opportunity.
What's funny about all of that is, like, even within SAG-AFTRA, we have these initiatives for equal opportunity employment, and then we have state laws for equal opportunity employment, and it's very much illegal to inquire as to someone's any protected status. You cannot inquire if someone has children. You can't ask about their living situation. You can't ask about their sexual orientation. You can't ask about their race or their ethnic background.
Even their age.
And you can't ask about disabilities. or if they're pregnant. So like there are all these things
Yeah.
that you would base it, like production would have to kind of be breaking the law to enforce these equal opportunity statutes in a way. But I guess, and you know, it is tricky because you are asking people to out themselves.
Yeah, you know, that part I have thought about, but I never really thought about the protection things that like legally these are things that they can't ask in a job interview.
So I don't really know how that all works because, you know, I think it is honorable to say that you're requesting these types of people in the first round of auditions, but then you're going to be like, so
Are you?
know, which way do you swing? Like,
Yeah.
how do you verify it?
That it is a really gray area in doing what's morally right versus what's legally
Right.
okay. No, that's an interesting way to look at that.
But it's what the moment requires because
Yeah.
until we can like honestly just move past the entire concept of sexual orientation and gender, which is inevitable in my opinion, we're just going to be stuck in, you know, different iterations of the same conversation.
Yeah.
Like, how do we force people to not be hateful towards someone who's not like them?
Yeah.
It's basically just the same nonsense. But, you know, I really do love that there was an opportunity that came up to create a sequel and Nathan Lane was on board and they came up with this concept of like, Armand has died and he's trying to figure out what to do next with his life. And he like goes on some, you know, like journey to Guatemala with Agador. But then Hank Azaria was like, no, I
don't feel right playing this anymore.
Well, he didn't feel right about the gay caricature and he didn't feel right about the ethnic caricature. So he has a very conflicted relationship with the character. And I would think that members of both of those communities would have a really conflicted relationship with the character. Because on one hand, so many people love it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the drag community is always going to be like a very noisy proponent for the LGBTQIA community. So it's hard to extricate their love for the Birdcage from some new ethical standard.
Right.
It's all very tricky.
It is. And I mean, and speaking of tricky, like there's some really great dialogue in this movie.
Right.
Like really great funny jokes, but they all revolve like almost every sentence that I'm being hyperbolic, but I'd say a good 60% of the dialogue that comes from Robin Williams drops. Like every joke has the F-bomb.
But so much of that is also wrapped up with drag culture.
Yeah.
Which is very in your face and purposely offensive in many ways. So, you know, like that's where it's coming from on one hand, but I could see how maybe it doesn't help the conversation with conservatives. Although, no matter what, we have the caricature of the conservative. We have Gene Hackman as Senator Keeley, who's named his daughter Barbara. There were a mountain of references to different conservatives.
Yeah. Rush Limbaugh, Billy Graham.
Rush Limbaugh. Oh, what is...
The Bushes come up multiple times.
Oh, right. So do you want to go over like the scandal that goes down?
Yeah. So, you know, just like in the late 80s, early 90s, both sides of the aisle were leaning more into being, you know, moral and whatnot, but especially the conservative. So he was like co-chair of this like moral group, but his mentor and the main person from that group died, but he was found dead in bed with a black underage prostitute.
Not a good look.
Not a good look. And so, you know, they're in spin control mode. Like everybody's trying to come after them and get, you know, comments and pictures of him. And now he's got to go meet, you know, his in-laws or his future son-in-law's family for the first time, and the wife is trying to convince him that it would be good. Like having a marriage really quickly shows that they are moral and believe in tradition. So
can
it's
I just
like
say
weird.
at the beginning of that they're watching like a conservative news talk show and they're just like screaming about politics, and she walks in and he says, "It's a wonderful show. It's the most intelligent show on television."
Yeah. Oh my God.
There's so many caricatures of conservatives in this that are somehow more relevant today than they were at the time.
Yeah.
That was kind of eerie.
Yeah, because like Fox News wasn't huge yet. CNN, even CNN, was still fairly new and wasn't doing as much editorial kind of coverage yet. So this was like kind of trippy how much it predicted things now.
When they're discussing rushing this marriage through with their 18-year-old daughter to this 20-year-old boy, Val, played by the disappointing, frankly, Dan Futterman.
He was like almost 30, playing a 20-year-old, and she was 32.
Milk toast incarnate. Although, like, he really didn't stand a chance.
No.
Looking at who else is in the room in every single scene. Where was I going with this? So they're talking about like rushing through this irresponsible marriage, and his wife, played by Diane Wiest, Louise.
One of them.
She says, well, we could even get like an endorsement from the Pope. And he said, no, he's too controversial. Billy Graham. No, he's too liberal.
Oh.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Billy Graham.
We didn't talk about this at all yet, but one of the other things that I found to be crazy and offensive, and once it just kind of fits with the movie, but they are the Goldmans, and they're Jewish, and for whatever reason, I mean, I understand, anti-Semitism, they say that the name is Coleman. And everything. And it's just like, how are they going to hide this? Like, there's going to be a wedding with the marriage certificate that has to be verified with like birth certificates and everything. Like, I still
they
can't
could
get
both
this.
change their names.
They could change their names before the wedding to do that. But still, all the certificate stuff, like, how were they going to hide the fact that they were Jewish their entire lives?
The whole thing was stupid.
And the fact that, it's a gay couple, like they were never going to spend holidays together.
Well,
or
why did they need to get
grandchildren.
married so fast?
Well, that was like another weird thing that I didn't get. So you mentioned at the beginning that we learn a lot about their relationship, Albert and Armand's.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot, like what was causing Albert to have the panic attack was just, a little bit of diva behavior. But he was also convinced that Armand was having an affair. And, I didn't notice this until actually while we were recording this, and I started thinking about it. Val was born because on a one-night drunken thing, Armand decided to sleep with a woman, and that's where the baby came from, and they were well-to-do, so they just paid the woman off to have the baby and raise it. But there's just this deep distrust of Armand, which I thought, like, the first time I noticed it was this viewing. But it was weird because Armand is, like, pissed at Val when he says he's getting married. And even Val's like, yeah, I never thought I would get married. I hate marriage. But, this is, like, weird thing. And then Albert is even like, he's getting married? We hate marriage. Like, it was just this weird thing. Like, they all seem to hate marriage.
The whole thing just seems like a dumb idea to satisfy
bigots.
The whim of, like, two idiots.
Yeah.
Like, clearly it's not a good match, and clearly you have some growing up to do if you can't handle your parents not liking your in-laws.
On both sides. Like, both Callista Flockhart as Barb and Val are both, like, they know. Like, she knows what's up. It's just really... I just still, we watched this a couple of days ago at this point as of recording, and I still just can't just suspend my disbelief of the premise of the film. Like, it just seems so alien and absurd and just wrong.
And, like, does Barbara not know that he has two dads?
No, she does know. And she knows they're Goldman and everything. Like, there's a point when Nathan Lane is dressed up pretending to be a woman. She even says something like, I almost wish she was going to be my mother-in-law. And then she goes... They're like, that's Albert. She's like, of course I know, but it's just kind of nice. Like, she knows.
Another thing that I really didn't like about it was that it just felt like Val was Armand's son and not Albert's son.
Until the very end of the movie.
Right. So, like, did they raise him together?
They did.
So, like, it just doesn't compute,
Well, and that's what drove me crazy, and it made me, like, I had no sympathy for Val. Like, I hated Val.
Yeah.
Because very early on, he tells, like, they meet, him and Armand meet behind Albert's back while Albert's performing, and Albert thinks he's having an affair because he's got white wine in the fridge, because that's what Val likes to drink. Even though he asked for beer because he's pretending to be more macho because he's trying to impress, his conservative family. But they hide the whole fact that they're meeting. They hide the fact that he's getting married for a little bit. And then they go, we're just going to get Albert to leave for a few days. And then when Albert's like, that's messed up, I'm not going to do that. They're like, oh, well, we're going to spend 5 hours teaching him how to be a man. We're going to pass him off as a straight uncle. And then they try to get him to leave again, and it's too late. And they make fun of him when he tries to do it. Like, he dresses up in a nice suit.
Right.
And he's just like, I'm willing to be a different person for you because I love you. And I want to be here for you on your night. And I want to help you impress your in-laws. And now you're saying it's worse when I pretend to be straight. I'm just going to go. But then they try to get the biological mom to show up, and she's late.
She gets stuck at a drawbridge.
Yeah. And
for like 3 hours.
Yeah. So they, Albert still, goes basically in drag and pretends to be the mom and really dazzles the family, even being, more liberal. And like every step of the movie, they're just like, Val's like, you got to get rid of your whole house. Like, get rid of all your decor. And he's like snapping at everybody. And he's, like you said, he's just like awful to Albert.
Well, and he kind of just like showed up and was like, and this all has to happen in the next like 48 hours. Like, why? What is going on, dude?
Yeah.
Do you need money? Do you need drugs?
Well,
like,
no, it's because
what's the emergency?
It's because the mom wanted to rush it through so that way they can have a quick marriage and get the scandal to wash away.
So stupid. It doesn't make any sense.
I just absolutely hated Val.
Yeah.
The entire movie.
I didn't like him at all.
Even at the end when he's just like, and this was weird. And it's like,
and he barely seemed to have any remorse about his behavior.
Yeah, it wasn't until the very end when the biological mom shows up. And this seemed really contrived. The biological mom shows up and like, oh, I'm Val's mom. And then Gene Hackman's like, we already met his mom. There's two moms. Which is your real mom?
Right.
And he goes, this is my real mom to Albert. Like, Albert raised me. They're gay. And it's like, did he really like look at him as a mother and not as like having two fathers? Like, even I found a problem with even that at the end of the movie when there's like, this is who I am. This is my parent. And I love them. It wasn't like I had two great parents.
And
it's
I
like,
guess,
this is my mom.
Part of that is also perhaps Albert's arc, because he identifies so much with his character and Starina. Like when you're in drag, you're referred to as she.
Right.
So I could see how like maybe at the time that made a little bit more sense than it does in the context of today where we're, marginally more informed about trans people and their experience and their transition versus drag.
Right, but I don't get the vibe that Albert was actually trans because when they
don't either.
Yeah, because when they mentioned something, I don't remember what the joke was, but they said like a tiny package. He's like, well, not tiny. Like he very clearly cared that people knew he had a big dick.
Right. So I think it might have just been like the whole she thing and the feminine persona and the mother thing.
Well, and I think there was still
and it's weird because like when he finds out that Val is coming, he's like, doesn't he like go get a cake and everything? And he's like all excited about it. It's like his baby's coming home. Yeah. Like I totally bought that. But then when they're in the same room,
there just seemed utter disdain.
It was distance.
Yeah.
It was so weird.
And it just seemed like both Armand and Val treated Albert like he is a burden. And it was just, it was weird. But like the other thing I think is like, I don't know if this is still to this day, it's less prominent, but there used to be for people who were homophobic or just didn't really know because it was still new. There was always this idea that, and you still see it in movies, which one's the woman? Like there has to be somebody who's submissive.
Was one of my notes.
Yeah.
Well, Albert says, don't worry about that. I'm very maternal. And oh no, it was Armand. Was it? Don't worry about that. I'm very maternal, and Albert's practically a breast. Fuck, who said that?
I think that was Armand.
Was it?
I
can't remember.
But it's just
why.
It was just very problematic, and it feels weird me being like outraged about a movie that's having some harmful stereotypes still, even though this was at the time given so much praise for not being so stereotypical by giving them depth and having them show real emotion and being part of a family. But looking at it in the lens of 2022, it feels very harmful stereotypes.
And then it like drops in jokes that like leave your mouth on the floor. Like we find out later on that the other senator's last words were your money's on the dresser chocolate. Like,
yeah.
Damn. How much money did this movie make?
180 something million.
It's insane. Like, it's blowing my mind how much this film got away with. And yet, like, you know, it's just another one of those, like, product of its time things. Like, I'm so torn because it's so enjoyable and the performances are fantastic and the characters are fun and the dialogue is incredible. And yet, so much of it is problematic.
Like, there's an abortion story at one point because they're, you know, pretending to be more conservative than they are, but they let their, you know, liberalisms kind of slip in every once in a while. But they're talking about abortion, and Albert, playing the mom, says something along the lines of like, you know, they say they want to kill the mothers or punish the mothers for abortion,
right?
And she's like, well, just kill them. Like, yeah, it'll kill the fetus, but you know, they were gonna die anyway, so why not let it go down with this ship? And I was just like, that's still like so relevant to today. Like, there were so many, like Trump said he wouldn't be opposed to prison or death penalty for women who get abortion. So it's just like, it's like,
funny that was the insane extreme in this movie that became reality for some people.
It's just
it feels like we're in this kind of weird dystopia, honestly, in some ways. When we revisit these kinds of topics in these kinds of films, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah,
this is the worst timeline.
I just don't like, I'm having a hard time talking about this movie because it's just like, I don't want to just bash the movie because it was an important film.
Right.
And it's still considered an important film. Like, I know people still really like this movie, but it wasn't something that was a huge part of my childhood. Like I said, before we actually watched the movie, and, you know, this was just one of the few queer friendly films that I had seen as a child. And it was, so it was default the movie we had to do. So like, I feel like I want to defend this movie, but I also feel like it's not sacred to me. So I kind of have a hard time defending it, but it's also not my place to do either.
Right. It's a quandary.
Wrapped in a conundrum.
Should we just talk about some little tidbits that were fun?
Yeah.
So like I said, this is the 7th iteration of this. There was a French version, like a Spanish version. There was a lot going on. Ennio Morricone did the music for the French one, but it looks like not only just the first one, but the second one and the third one, which is pretty crazy. You know, this is the guy, he did over 400 scores. He was also a classical composer, and to do
a legend.
Something like this just seems so strange, but the music is really fun. Sondheim actually wrote 3 songs specifically for this English version. He wrote It Takes All Kinds, and there was another one that was originally meant to be the opening number to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Yeah. So thought that was like interesting with the Nathan Lane connection there. Director Mike Nichols would laugh so hard on set that he occasionally had to be covered up with a blanket.
Yeah, I read the there are a few like pratfalls in this, but there's one when they're in the kitchen having shrimp and Hank Azaria falls, and both Robin Williams and Dan Flutterman are like very obviously trying not to laugh, which I thought, and they kept it in. I thought that was really funny because you could see them like grimacing, trying not to laugh,
they
almost
just
like they're in pain.
Going. Well, and you hear like him yelling, "It's okay, everything's okay," which is kind of like your way of cluing in the crew that you haven't injured yourself and you're gonna keep going. But like they're all trying so hard not to laugh.
Yeah.
I love that. David Alan Grier was originally set to play Agador.
Oh, that would have been interesting.
That would have been very interesting. In the French version, the butler is black, but this being America, they thought it might be distasteful.
But also being in South Florida, it would make sense to be Guatemalan, Cuban, Puerto Rican.
Right.
Yeah.
I like it.
Just, a scene that I really liked, to go back to essentially the opening scene where we really get the dynamic of Albert and Armand when he's having the panic attack. And Armand knows this is just what Albert does. So he pretends that he's going to put somebody else on to get Albert worked up where he has to prove himself. But there was this really great thing where you mentioned this, towards the top where Agador is, pretending to create a crisis to also have to make Albert to be the level-headed one. But he says oh, here you go. And he gives him some drugs. And Armand's like, what are you doing giving him drugs? What is this? Pyrin tablets. And Albert keeps saying, I would just crumble if it wasn't for these Pyrin. He's like, oh, I just crossed off the A and the S on aspirin. And Armand's like, you genius. I just thought that was hilarious.
It's insane. So let's wrap it up a little bit. What were some of your favorite parts?
I did find it really funny when Gene Hackman was in drag at the end.
Oh, that was beautiful.
And then him, she's like, nobody wants to dance with me.
I love the scene where they're trying to teach the choreography to the backup dancer for Albert's scene, and he's just slow on the uptake. He's not giving it his all. He's chewing gum. He's being disrespectful. So suddenly we get Armand doing a whole history of dance thing where he actually had this choreographed for him where he's doing stereotypical moves for each choreographer, and he does the whole Madonna transition that I think is probably burned into everyone's heads because that was definitely in the trailer for this film.
Yeah.
So it's always fun seeing that and getting that reminder of where that came from and why it's in the back of my brain. Later in the film, there's a whole exchange when the conservatives are going to show up and they make Agador put on a butler uniform. And he says, I don't even want to say it. He says, I'm going to look like a and he's like, well, you're going to look like a in a uniform. But then he ends up not wearing the shoes. And then you see the next scene after that when he's out of the uniform, he's wearing a muscle tank, a cropped muscle tank that says straight looking. I love that.
Yeah. I just...
Oh, and that they were staying, when they were in town, they were staying with Jeb Bush.
Yeah, that was really funny. It was a bizarre movie. I like the satire that's still relevant today, although it's terrifying. It was interesting to go back and watch this, but I just feel I don't have much to say about this movie. I just feel like it's not my place to really comment on this movie.
It's a minefield as a cis white male.
It is, and I recognize that there are gaps in my knowledge. But
me being a pansexual Latina,
yeah,
I'm white, so I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm in the same boat as you, for being honest.
And I do think it's important for, not that our opinions matter more than anybody else, but I think it's important that people recognize that we have gaps. That even though we like to look at ourselves as allies and we don't judge people, we're gonna say things that and if there's anything that I've said that's offensive or wrong in this podcast, I would welcome anybody to say, hey, what you said isn't right or it's not kosher, because I am one of those people who want to learn and be the best ally that I can be. So I'm just gonna take if there's anything that I said that's offensive or wrong, or if I made a stance that I feel like this movie's offensive and people don't feel that way, I'm totally be happy to be put in my place and say it.
Well, in the description, we have our voicemail. So honestly, if anyone ever wants to give us feedback, they can just leave us a voicemail.
Yeah, and we're happy to.
We will take it into account.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people feel the same way about this movie, and that we feel conflicted enjoying it because it is so enjoyable, and there are some really great people involved and some great performances, and that's just growing pains.
Yeah.
I think it's good that we have that discomfort in our gut of knowing that, that was a little bit ignorant.
Yeah. And it's, you got to look at it things like this, things like Will and Grace, which were still stereotypical and whatnot. paved the way. Like, if we couldn't do things like that, we wouldn't have got shows like Looking, which were real and raw versions of like people's lives in San Francisco. And that TV show blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind.
Blow your mind.
And I think that's great.
Yeah.
And everything. But it's like, if Looking came out in 1996, that could not have been made in 1996.
No. I mean, like, same scripts, definitely not the same camera angles.
Right.
Definitely not the same camera angles. All right. Where can our listeners find you, Michael?
I don't really do much on my socials, so it's just the MDXpod stuff. So MDXpods.com, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all at MDXpods. We are also on YouTube. Check us out there. And that's all I've got.
I'm all over the internet at Katrina Ossity, although I don't really post recently because I just don't like humans.
Yep.
But that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.